Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing cases in Briarfield Township, Pennsylvania, in recorded history. Before we start, please leave a comment about where you are and when you heard this story. We want to know where these documented accounts come from and when they come in. The winter of 1953 hit Briarfield Township harder than usual, which seemed to match the darkness that was settling over this small Pennsylvania town. This small township in Westmoreland County, with only about 400 residents, had always been proud of the predictable rhythms of farm life and the quiet dignity of families who had worked the same land for generations. Township Road was the main road that connected small farms to a small business district that included Henley's General Store, the Briarfield Methodist Church, and a post office that also served as the community's social center. The case of Cordelia Ravencrest started to unfold against this peaceful, rural setting. At the time, not many people in the area knew they were seeing the start of what would turn out to be one of Pennsylvania's most confusing and disturbing criminal investigations. Cordelia Ravencrest was a 42-year-old woman who ran a boarding house on the edge of Briarfield Township. The place, which is known locally as Ravencrest Manor, was a 3-story Victorian building that her grandfather, Maximilian Ravencrest, built in 1897. He was a businessman who made his money in the coal industry before moving to the countryside to retire. The main house, some outbuildings, and 23 acres of woods made up the property. The woods gave the property privacy and kept it away from the nearest neighbors. Township records show that Cordelia got the property in 1948 after her aunt, Perpetual Ravencrest, died. She had run the boarding house for almost 30 years. The business mostly served traveling salespeople, seasonal workers, and people who needed a place to stay for a short time while they looked for a new job or dealt with personal problems. The boarding house usually had 5 to 8 residents at a time, but the number could change based on the season and the economy. People who lived near Cordelia said she was a capable but somewhat shy woman who ran her business well while keeping a respectful distance from both her tenants and the community as a whole. Barnaby Whitlock, who ran the dairy farm next door, later told investigators that Cordelia ran her business with strict rules. She posted detailed house rules for her tenants and kept regular schedules for meals, cleaning, and other household tasks. The social dynamics around Ravencrest Manor were complicated and showed how the community felt about people who came and went. The boarding house offered essential services for travelers and temporary workers. However, numerous long-term residents regarded it with skepticism, perceiving it as a potential source of instability within their orderly, rural community. This made the tension worse because Cordelia didn't talk about her tenants with her neighbors very often and had strict rules about privacy and confidentiality. The Ravencrest family has always been in a strange place in the social hierarchy of Briarfield Township. They owned a lot of property and seemed to be doing well with their business, but they had never fully joined the community's social networks. Maximilian Ravencrest was known for being private and not wanting to be involved in community activities, even though he was rich and powerful. This pattern has continued through the generations, with family members keeping polite but distant relationships with their neighbors. Local records show that the Ravencrest family has also been involved in a number of strange events over the years. In 1923, a boarder at the boarding house disappeared without a word, leaving behind personal items and an unpaid bill. In 1934, another tenant was found dead in his room, but the reasons for his death were never fully explained. The official cause of death was natural causes. In 1941, a traveling salesman told the police that he thought other people living in the boarding house were doing illegal things, but he couldn't give them any specific information and left the area before a formal investigation could be done. At the time, these events were thought to be one-time things, and there was no pattern that could have pointed to ongoing issues at the establishment. But they would later become important when investigators started looking into the full history of Ravencrest Manor and how it worked. On January 18, 1954, Postmaster Gerald Stinson noticed that mail for Ravencrest Manor had been piling up for more than a week. This was the start of the case that would turn these unrelated events into proof of a bigger pattern. In a place where mail delivery was a good sign of normal activity, this kind of buildup was immediately interesting. Stinson told Sheriff Clarence Decker about what he had seen during the sheriff's regular visit to the post office that afternoon. Sheriff Decker had been in his job for 15 years and was a careful person. He handled these kinds of things with his usual care. When he first went to Ravencrest Manor on the night of January 18th, there were no obvious signs of trouble. The building looked safe because all the doors and windows were closed properly, and there were no signs of damage or forced entry. But when Decker knocked on the front door and got no answer, he noticed a few strange things that would later be very important to the official investigation. The most important thing to notice was that there was no activity at all in the building. There were no lights, no sounds of people moving or talking, and no smoke coming from the chimneys, even though it was cold outside. It was very strange for a boarding house that usually had a lot of people living there to be so quiet. Decker also noticed that newspapers had been piling up on the front porch, which meant that no one had been there to pick them up for a few days. Sheriff Decker was worried about what he saw and decided to go inside the building to check on the people inside. It was strange that the front door was unlocked because Cordelia was known for being careful about security. Decker saw something that was both ordinary and very disturbing inside the building. The main floor of the boarding house looked like it was in good shape. The shared spaces were tidy and clean. The kitchen looked fine, and the dining room was ready for the next meal, but the place settings had started to collect dust. But a thorough search of the building showed that it was completely empty. Cordelia and her tenants were not there, and there was no sign of where they might have gone. The state of the rooms was even more confusing. There were 8 bedrooms in the boarding house, and each one had personal items that looked like they belonged to the tenants. There were clothes in closets and dresser drawers, toiletries in the shared bathrooms, books and other personal items on nightstands and desks. There were suitcases in a few rooms that were only partially packed, as if the people who lived there had started getting ready to leave but had to stop before they were done. Decker found evidence of a similar pattern in Cordelia's private rooms on the 3rd floor. Her personal things, like jewelry and a lot of cash in a strongbox that had been left unlocked, were still there. Her winter coat was hanging where it usually does, and her daily clothes seemed to be all there, which meant she hadn't left on a planned trip. The most disturbing thing was found in the basement of the building, which Cordelia used for storage and household tasks. Decker found proof that a meal had been made, but not served here. There were big pots of soup and other food on a wood-burning stove that had long since gone cold. The food had gone bad, and the smell was so strong that it filled the basement of the building. Sheriff Decker's first look into the case showed that everyone who lived in the boarding house had left at the same time, leaving behind their things and stopping what they were doing in the middle of it. It was especially strange that there were no signs of a fight or forced departure. It looked like 9 people had just disappeared, with no sign of where they had gone or why they had left. Over the next week, the first investigation included talking to neighbors and local business owners who might have seen or talked to Cordelia or her tenants. This process brought to light a number of important facts about how the boarding house worked and how the people who lived there acted in the days leading up to their disappearance. Barnaby Whitlock said that he had noticed that Ravencrest Manor was less busy than usual starting around January 10th. He usually saw tenants coming and going all day, walking to the village center or working in the property's gardens. But in the week before he found the empty building, he hadn't seen anything like that. He also said that the smoke from the building's chimneys, which could usually be seen all winter long, had stopped a few days before Sheriff Decker's visit. Martha Henley, who ran the general store, told us how Cordelia and her tenants bought things. Cordelia usually went to the store twice a week to buy food and other things for the boarding house according to her records. But her last visit was on January 8th, and she only bought a few things far less than what would be needed to keep the business running for more than a few days. Reverend Augustine Morris of the Briarfield Methodist Church gave us some more interesting information. Reverend Morris said that Cordelia came to see him on January 12th and asked for what she called spiritual guidance on some tough choices. The Reverend said that Cordelia was acting very upset during this visit. She talked about duties and family responsibilities that she found to be getting more and more difficult to handle. She had also made vague references to duties that she had inherited that went against her own conscience. Reverend Morris's story about this conversation made it sound like Cordelia was going through a lot of emotional pain before she went missing, but she didn't want to go into detail about what was bothering her. Instead, she spoke in general terms about family traditions and expectations that she felt she couldn't meet. Cordelia asked for prayers for strength to do the right thing at the end of the conversation, but she didn't say what she was thinking about doing. These interviews made a timeline that shows the disappearance happened between January 12th and January 18th. But they didn't explain why Cordelia and all of her tenants would have left at the same time, leaving their things behind and leaving the boarding house without telling anyone, including neighbors or local authorities. Sheriff Decker decided to look into the backgrounds and identities of the missing tenants, which made the investigation bigger. This process uncovered facts that turned the case from a simple missing person investigation into something much more complicated and disturbing. Records found in Cordelia's office showed that 8 people were living in the boarding house at the time of the disappearance. But when people tried to confirm the identities and backgrounds of these people, they found major inconsistencies and oddities that made it seem like the situation wasn't as simple as it first seemed. 3 of the tenants had signed up under names that turned out to be fake after an investigation. The ID cards and references these people gave could not be checked or were found to be fake. 2 other tenants had given correct identification but had lied about their jobs and why they were staying in the area. It seemed that only 3 of the 8 tenants had given completely honest information about who they were and what was going on with them. During a thorough search of the tenants' rooms, more disturbing things were found. Investigators found things in several rooms that were hidden among personal items that made them very suspicious about what the missing people were doing and why they were missing. These things included fake ID cards, maps of the area with strange symbols on them, and collections of newspaper articles about unsolved crimes and missing persons cases from all over Pennsylvania and nearby states. Investigators found a suitcase in one room that looked like it had surveillance equipment in it. It had binoculars, cameras with telephoto lenses, and detailed notes about the daily lives of different people in Briarfield Township. The notes had details about when certain people left their homes, how they usually got around, and times when their homes were empty. There were things in another room that made it look like the person who lived there had been doing some kind of research on local history and property records. The township maps showed property lines and who owned what, and the notebooks had a lot of information about the genealogies of local families, including the Ravencrests and other well-known families. The most worrisome thing was finding a stack of papers in Cordelia's private rooms that showed what her boarding house really did. Investigators found records in a secret compartment in her bedroom armoire that showed Ravencrest Manor had been used for things other than running a legitimate boarding house. These records showed that people who wanted to go missing or change their identities were given temporary housing, fake documents, and help moving to other places. It seems that the operation had been going on for a few years and had helped people from all walks of life, including those who were running away from legal problems, personal problems, or other situations that made it necessary for them to leave their old lives behind. The papers also showed that this operation was part of a bigger network that stretched across Pennsylvania and into nearby states. Cordelia kept in touch with people in other places who ran similar businesses. This made it possible for people to move around large areas without being found by police or anyone else who might be looking for them. It was even more troubling to learn that some of the people this network helped were running away from serious criminal charges. Police records found in Cordelia's files showed that a number of her former clients were wanted for violent crimes, fraud, and other serious crimes. It looked like the network was a place for people who needed to get away quickly and completely, no matter what their reasons were for being desperate. This finding turned the search for Cordelia into a much bigger investigation into crime that went far beyond Briarfield Township. Sheriff Decker called the state government, and by February 1954, a group of investigators had been sent to look into what looked like an interstate crime ring. The bigger investigation showed that Ravencrest Manor had been an important part of a network that had been around for at least 15 years. Records showed that hundreds of people had gotten help from the operation during this time, and many of them had completely disappeared from official records after that. Most of the time, when police tried to find these people, they were able to take on new identities and were never found. The investigation did, however, find proof of a darker side to the network's activities. In a few cases, people who had asked the network for help had later been found dead in strange ways. Local authorities had a hard time finding any patterns or connections between these deaths because they happened in different places and were caused by different things. A thorough examination of these cases indicated that the fatalities generally transpired within 6 months to 2 years following the individual's receipt of assistance from the network. In all of the cases, the people involved had been living under false identities in places that were far from their real homes. There were times when the deaths looked like they were caused by accidents or natural causes, but the fact that they happened so often made it seem like something more organized was going on. More research showed that these deaths happened a lot when the people had just started to build stable lives with their new identities or had tried to get in touch with family or friends from their old lives. This pattern suggested that the network kept an eye on its former clients in some way and took steps to keep them from putting the operation's security at risk. The fact that the network was connected to more than one murder raised the investigation to the level of the federal government. In March 1954, FBI agents joined the investigation, which then grew to include similar operations in the eastern United States. But this larger investigation ran into a lot of problems because the criminal operation was so complicated, and the criminals took a lot of steps to stay hidden. The network was set up so that no one person could see all the information. People like Cordelia worked on their own and only talked to other nodes in the network when they needed to move clients. This compartmentalized structure meant that finding one operation didn't always mean that the others were in danger. The network also made sure not to make permanent records that could be used as proof in court cases. Most of the communication between the different parts of the operation had been done by talking or sending coded messages that looked harmless. Cash was used for business transactions, and client records were kept in forms that could be quickly destroyed if needed. It was even harder to figure out what happened because Cordelia and everyone else who was at Ravencrest Manor when they went missing were still missing. Even after thorough searches and investigations in Pennsylvania and nearby states, no sign of these 9 people was ever found. It looked like they were gone for good, which meant that they had successfully turned on the same systems that had helped their clients disappear. But the investigation did find some important things. Finding the network led to the arrest of several people running similar businesses in other states. These arrests messed up the network's work and forced the closing of several places that had been used to provide illegal identity transformation services. The investigation also led to the solving of a number of criminal cases that had not yet been solved. Information found at Ravencrest Manor helped police find criminals who were thought to be permanently out of reach of justice. In some cases, people who had used the network's services were found and arrested, and they were found guilty of crimes that had happened years before. By the end of 1954, federal investigators were sure they knew the basic structure and operations of the criminal network, but they still had a lot of questions about how it was set up and how it got its money. Because important people, like Cordelia herself, were not there, many questions about how the network worked could never be fully answered. The investigation officially ended in early 1955, but some parts of the case were still open in federal files. The government took over the Ravencrest Manor property and left it empty for a few years while the courts decided what to do with it. Finally, a development company bought the property, tore down the Victorian mansion, and split the land into smaller lots for building homes. However, the case got a lot of attention from academics, especially those who study organized crime and identity theft. In 1957, Dr. Lander Peaton, a criminologist at the University of Pennsylvania, wrote a long article about the case for the American Journal of Criminal Justice. His analysis gave the public the most in-depth look at how the network worked and what it meant for understanding complex criminal groups. Dr. Peaton's study showed that the network was an early example of what would later be seen as organized crime's growth into identity theft and document forgery. His analysis showed that the operation was very advanced for its time, using methods and tools that wouldn't be common in criminal businesses for another 10 years. The study also looked at the social and economic factors that made it possible for this kind of business to exist in rural Pennsylvania. Dr. Peaton contended that the amalgamation of geographic seclusion, constrained law enforcement resources, and community norms prioritizing privacy and non-interference fostered an environment conducive to sophisticated criminal enterprises with negligible risk of detection. Researchers continued to be interested in the case throughout the 1960s, using it as a case study for different parts of criminal organization and law enforcement methods. But by the early 1970s, the case was mostly forgotten by scholars, and the public was more interested in newer criminal cases. A construction crew working on a residential development on the old Ravencrest property made a discovery in 1963 that could have kept the story from being just a footnote in history. While digging the foundation for a new house, workers found a metal container that had been carefully hidden under where the mansion's basement used to be. It looked like Cordelia had hidden papers and other things in the container before she went missing. These materials gave us new information about how the network works and showed us things that weren't known during the first investigation. Most importantly, they had records that showed the network's activities were much bigger than what had been thought before. The new documents showed that the Identity Transformation Network had branches in at least 12 states and had been running for more than 20 years. The records also showed that the network had worked with not only people who wanted to change their identities, but also organized crime groups that needed to move people or hide assets from the police. Documents that showed the network had been involved in what looked like organized murder-for-hire operations were even more disturbing. Clients who became a problem or threatened to reveal what the network was doing were killed, sometimes months or years after they had used the network's services. These killings were done by experts who traveled around the network's area, making it look like the deaths were caused by accidents, natural causes, or random violence. The finding of these papers led to a new federal investigation in 1964. But this investigation was even harder than the first one, because it had been almost 10 years since the network's activities had been stopped. A lot of people who could have been witnesses had died or gone missing, and a lot of the evidence that could have been found in 1954 had been lost or destroyed. Even with these problems, the new investigation did find some things. There were a few more cases found where people who had used the network services died under strange circumstances later. In some of these cases, there was still enough evidence to show that the deaths were murders, but the killers were never found. The investigation also found that some parts of the network kept working even after Ravencrest Manor closed. The Pennsylvania branch was shut down, but similar businesses had opened up in other states, apparently run by people who had been part of the original network. These new operations used a lot of the same methods, but they were set up in a way that made them less likely to be found, like the Pennsylvania operation was. Federal investigators spent 2 years trying to find and stop these ongoing operations. By 1966, they had managed to shut down several more facilities and arrest a number of people who were connected to the network. But they admitted that other parts of the operation were probably still going on, and they might have learned from the mistakes that led to previous discoveries. Once again, the investigation was officially over in 1967, but federal agencies kept an eye out for signs of similar operations. The case files were kept secret and stored away, and the only public information about the investigation was basic information about the original disappearance at Ravencrest Manor. During this time, no one knew what had happened to Cordelia Ravencrest or the 8 people who had gone missing with her. Even after a lot of searching and investigating, no sign of any of these people was ever found. Federal investigators came to the conclusion that they were most likely killed to keep them from talking about how the network worked, even though their bodies were never found. But something happened in 1968 that called this conclusion into question. A woman who said she was Cordelia Ravencrest contacted federal authorities through a third party and said she was still alive and willing to share information about the network in exchange for not being charged with a crime. A lawyer in California who said he was representing the woman made the contact, but he wouldn't say where she was or what was going on with her. Federal investigators didn't believe this contact was real because they couldn't be sure that the woman was really Cordelia Ravencrest. The lawyer shared some information about the network that hadn't been made public, which made it seem like his client did know how the operation worked. But someone who had been involved with the network in some other way could have gotten a lot of this information. Negotiations went on for months, with federal officials offering different types of immunity in exchange for information that would help them find and arrest other members of the network. But the woman's requests became more and more specific and unreasonable, which made investigators think they were dealing with someone who wasn't really Cordelia but was trying to get something by pretending to be her. In early 1969, the lawyer suddenly ended the talks when he said that his client had decided not to help with the investigation. He didn't explain why he made this choice and wouldn't talk to federal officials again. After trying to find the lawyer again, it became clear that he had left his California office and had not left a forwarding address or phone number. This event was the last part of the official investigation into the Ravencrest Manor case. The federal government decided that they had followed all possible leads and that more work was unlikely to bring in any new useful information. The case was closed, but the files were still available for use in other investigations. In the 1970s and 1980s, the site of Ravencrest Manor was still being built up for residential use. The Victorian mansion was replaced by a residential neighborhood that didn't show any signs of the property's past. Most of the people who lived there didn't know that it used to be a crime hotspot. But there were some strange things that happened in the neighborhood that made people wonder if they were related to the past. Several people who lived there said they found buried things in their yards, like metal containers, strange tools, and papers written in codes that they couldn't figure out. Most of these finds were thought to be the result of the property's farming history or the random buildup of trash. However, some investigators wondered if they might be signs of network activity that hadn't been found during the first investigation. More interestingly, some people who lived there said that strange people had come to the area, people who said they were researchers, genealogists, or historians, but who seemed more interested in the exact spot where Ravencrest Manor used to be. These visitors often asked a lot of questions about the property's history and seemed let down when residents couldn't give them the answers they wanted. In 1982, one of these visitors was found to be a former federal investigator who had worked on the first Ravencrest Manor case. When local authorities got in touch with the retired investigator, he said that he still cared about the case and went to the site every so often in the hopes of finding new evidence that could help answer some of the questions that were still unanswered. He said that his visits had nothing to do with any official investigation, but he did say that other former investigators were still very interested in the case. This news made people think that the federal government knew more about the Ravencrest Manor case than they had let on. Some researchers said that the network was bigger and more complicated than what had been made public, and that ongoing investigations might be following leads that had not been made public. The discovery of papers in the University of Pennsylvania's archives in 1985 that were related to Dr. Piton's research on the case made these suspicions stronger. There was a folder in the papers that had never been made public or published that contained letters between Dr. Piton and federal investigators. This letter suggested that Dr. Piton had access to classified information about the network, and that his published study only showed a small part of what he had learned while doing his research. The letters also said that people had gotten in touch with Dr. Piton and said they knew what had happened to Cordelia Ravencrest. Some of these contacts had given Dr. Piton information about how the network worked that seemed believable, but he hadn't been able to check if it was true or not. The letters made it seem like he had kept getting these kinds of contacts in the 1960s and 1970s, but he had never been able to turn them into reliable sources of information. In 1978, Dr. Piton passed away, and the university library received his personal papers as a gift. But the folder with the letters from the federal government had been sealed and told not to be opened until 1995. Researchers found that the box not only held the letters but also Dr. Piton's private notes about parts of the case that he had never published when they finally opened it. These notes showed that Dr. Piton thought the network was much bigger than what federal investigators had said in public. He thought he had found links between the Pennsylvania operation and similar ones in more than 20 other states. This led him to believe that the network was a real national organization with a lot of money and advanced operational skills. Dr. Piton's notes about what he thought had happened to Cordelia Ravencrest and the other missing people were even more disturbing. After looking at how the network worked and how people talked to each other, he decided that they hadn't been killed but had been moved to other parts of the network where they still played important roles in its operations. This theory says that Cordelia's disappearance was a planned move to keep her from being caught and forced to give information about the network. The 8 people who had gone missing with her were other network operatives who had been at Ravencrest Manor for work and had to leave with Cordelia when it became clear that the place was about to be found. Dr. Piton's notes said that the evacuation went so smoothly and quickly because the network had planned for the possibility of being found and had made detailed plans for keeping important people safe. The fact that no trace of the missing people had ever been found did not mean that they had been killed. Instead, it meant that they had been successfully integrated into other parts of the network under new identities. Dr. Piton's study of events that happened at other suspected network facilities in the years after the Ravencrest Manor discoveries backed up this view of what happened. In a number of instances, facilities were deserted immediately prior to their detection by law enforcement, indicating that the network monitored law enforcement operations and evacuated vulnerable sites before they could be infiltrated. Dr. Piton's theory was never published, and the evidence that backed it up was mostly circumstantial links and patterns that could be understood in different ways. It was impossible to tell if his analysis was correct or if it was just a complicated theory that went beyond the evidence without direct proof or testimony from network participants. The revelation of Dr. Piton's private research rekindled scholarly interest in the Ravencrest Manor case, prompting several researchers in the 1990s to pursue subsequent investigations. But these efforts were slowed down by the fact that time was passing and federal investigation files were still being kept secret. Most of the original investigators had either retired or died, and many people who could have given information were no longer available. In 1998, a big event happened when renovation work at a church in western Pennsylvania uncovered a hidden room with papers that seemed to be linked to the Identity Transformation Network. The papers had client records, operational procedures, and communications that made it look like the church was another part of the network's operations. The discovery was especially important because the church had been run by a religious group that kept detailed records of what it did. These records confirmed some things about how the network worked that had only been known through federal investigations before. They also showed that the network had been running for longer and in more places than had been recorded before. The church papers showed that the network had been running since at least the 1930s and had helped thousands of people over the course of more than 20 years. The papers also showed that the network was very well organized, with set rules, trained staff, and advanced security measures that let it run for years without being found. The church documents had information about the network's leadership structure that wasn't available during the first investigations. The documents showed that a small group of people ran the network and kept an eye on operations across the country while staying carefully out of the way of day-to-day activities. In network communications, these leaders were only known by code names, and no one knew who they really were. But the documents gave enough information about their roles and duties to make it clear that they were very smart criminals with a lot of experience in organized crime and a lot of money. The church documents led to a new federal investigation in 1999. Even though this investigation was limited because the case was so old and many possible witnesses had died, federal investigators were still able to find a few people who were still alive and had been connected to the network. But most of these people said they didn't remember being involved or didn't want to help with the investigation. The investigation, on the other hand, did lead to one important result. Looking at the church's records revealed a pattern of financial transactions that could be linked to real businesses and people who had apparently given money to help run the network. Most of these financial ties went back many years, but some seemed to go back to the 1980s and 1990s. This suggests that parts of the network may have kept running long after places like Ravencrest Manor closed. This finding led to a larger investigation into organized crime in Pennsylvania and nearby states. Federal investigators found several cases where missing people, identity theft, and deaths that seemed suspicious might be linked to ongoing network operations. But it was hard to prove these links because criminals used advanced methods to hide their activities. The investigation went on until 2001, when it was officially closed because there weren't enough resources, and it was very unlikely that any cases would be strong enough to go to court. Federal investigators did say, though, that there were still many questions about the network that needed to be answered, and that parts of the organization might still be active. The residential area where Ravencrest Manor used to be looks completely normal today, with no signs of its criminal past. Most people who live there don't know what happened there more than 60 years ago, and the case has mostly been forgotten by the public. The Ravencrest Manor investigation, on the other hand, still affects how federal law enforcement deals with organized crime and identity theft. The case showed that highly organized criminal groups could work for a long time in rural areas where there weren't many police officers and people valued privacy and not interfering with others. It also showed how criminal organizations could use real businesses and social institutions to hide what they were doing while providing services that made it easier for other types of crime to happen. The Ravencrest Manor case showed how hard it is for police to look into criminal groups that are set up to survive the discovery and closure of individual parts. The network was able to keep running even after major parts of its infrastructure had been hacked because of its compartmentalized structure, advanced security measures, and thorough planning for emergencies. The Raven Crest Manor investigation has changed how the federal government looks into organized crime and helped create ways to get into complicated criminal networks. But the case also shows that some criminal groups may be smart enough to stay out of the reach of normal police methods. No one knows what happened to Cordelia Ravencrest and the 8 other people who went missing with her. Their disappearance is one of the most complete and successful vanishing acts in American criminal history. They could have been killed to protect network secrets, moved to other parts of the organization, or even escaped and started new lives free of crime. People who live in the neighborhood that now covers the old Ravencrest Manor site know that crime can happen behind the most normal and respectable looks. This case is one of the most detailed examples in Pennsylvania of organized crime operating for years in a community that had no idea what was really going on. The things that happened at Ravencrest Manor still have an effect on how police handle cases of identity theft, organized crime, and crime that happens on a regular basis. Federal investigators are still worried about whether similar networks are still running in modern-day America, using new methods to offer the same services that Cordelia Ravencrest's operation did. The case also makes us think about how privacy, community norms, and crime are connected in American society as a whole. Many rural communities in the United States still have the same characteristics that made the Ravencrest Manor network work well for years. They are isolated from other places, have little oversight, and place a high value on privacy. The most troubling thing about the Ravencrest Manor case is not what was found out about the criminal network, but what is still unknown about how it worked, and the fact that similar groups may still be out there, operating under the surface of everyday rural life and serving clients who need to disappear, which gives criminals and those willing to profit from desperation a chance to make money. The case will always remind us that some mysteries may never be fully solved, and some types of crime may be too well hidden to be fully understood or stopped.